Part 1. The Waters of Life. There were no nations then. The world was a vast oak forest that stretched from sunrise to sunset, where solitary hawthorns growing on hills above sacred springs marked an entrance to the land of faerie. It was a time of bog sacrifices, and of calling to Druid and Danann, of visions and stories about ogres and sea beasts. It was a time of raids from the men of the north, and sporadic winds of change. Evna felt change coming as surely as she felt the newly chill winds pushing at her back. She stood at the doorway of her hut and smelled early autumn arriving from the forest and stream. She heard the even song of birds and watched the hares twitch their whiskers. These were ordinary signs of life's cycle, not the cataclysm that approached. She waited for the spirits of the land to speak. A cricket clicked behind her. Evna turned and closed the door against the night. Sitting down to her table, she smelled the fat bundles of herbs hanging from the pegs on the wall. Among them were mugwort for cramp, loosestrife and willowbark for fever, terrestrial sun to ward off melancholy, yarrow for the bowels, and foxglove and hawthorn for the heart. Rue and hag's tapers were for cough. Long braids of garlic, useful for everything, swung from overhead, along with the all-important comfrey, vervain, figwort, and oak bark for poulticing wounds, the last hanging in dry strips from the thatch. A cloth bag full of hazelnuts stood propped against the wall, a strengthener for the weak and debilitated, to be eaten with oats. Baskets of dandelion roots, sacred to Druid, hung from the low ceiling, for those with an overfondness for mead. She had wild carrot seed to prevent conception, and a precious store of golden bough, still wrapped in its white cloth, for the barren and those with tumors of the wasting disease. The season of green summer was over, and she had labored long and hard to gather these simples. They were the mainstay of her healing art, along with a precious crock of the waters of life, which she kept on a shelf. The hut was big enough for a bed, a pallet, a sturdy oaken table, 2 chairs, and a large carved box near the fire in which to keep oats, barley, linens, and woolens from the damp. The primary feature of her home was the central hearth, which warmed her, cooked her meals, prepared her remedies, and provided her with company as the flames danced and glowed on quiet evenings. The hut was surrounded by hawthorn, elder, oak, and apple trees, and was visited in all seasons by villagers and others in need. On this day, the eve of Samhain, Evna barred the long door before the sun disappeared. She placed small, equal-armed crosses of rowan wood, bound with red wool, in the window and against the door, as protection from the mischievous bricta of the Coney She, the mischievous spirits sure to be about on the autumn holy night of the dead. Her gifts to the ancestors of cider, cheese, and fresh bread she had lain beneath the oldest apple tree. Pulling down a cracked and weathered willow basket from a hook on the roof tree, she hummed and stripped leaves from the branches of dried herbs, stifling an occasional sneeze as aromatic dust tickled her nose. "Druid!" she exclaimed, as a sharp stalk pierced her finger. She heard the patter of a mouse as it snuffled across the floor, looking for a drip of honey. When the herbs were packed in their baskets, it was deep into the night, and the full moon cast a hazy brightness on the bare branches outside. Evna heard 3 hoots of an owl, and wondered if this were a fairy spirit or a mortal bird come to bring dark tidings. The birds usually warned her within 3 days before someone ill or wounded arrived. This was a spirit night when anything was possible, and the omens were harder to read when so many of the faerie were abroad, causing mischief. She swept the remains of the herbs into her hand with the willow broom and spread them on the embers. The fire leaped and sparked as it met the herbs, then fell back to its steady glow. Evna carefully smoothed the fire, singing softly as she spread the ashes. May the triple goddess surround this house, this hearth. May the triple goddess shield this house, this eve, this night, and every night. Knowing not to venture out on this particular evening, she performed her ablutions indoors. A flick of water on the forehead, the eyes, the hands and feet, in the name of Danann, mother of the waters. Yawning, she pulled back the woolen coverlet and crept between linen sheets to drift into dream-laden sleep. In the morning, Evna ignored the first chorus of birdsong, as she always did, waiting instead for the second chorus, that followed about an hour after. By that time, the hut was thoroughly chilled as she faced the unpleasant prospect of darting across the earthen floor to feed the fire's embers. A strip of birch bark laid on the ashes burst immediately into flame. She laid on twigs of oak and ash and a few small branches of oak. On top of those, she laid 2 blocks of peat, and then skillfully swung the small black cauldron over to start the water boiling for an herbal brew. As she reached for the basket of elderberries, a warning squawk came from crows gathered in the trees outside. Evna stiffened and stood stock still to catch other sounds. Moving to the window, she pulled back the oiled sheepskin and peered through the opening. A tight knot of figures approached, 2 half lifting, half carrying another. She slipped on her linen gown and deerskin belt and ran a comb through her hair. Opening the door a crack to keep in as much warm air as possible, she waited for the figures to approach. "Evne, are you home?" one of the figures shouted. "In the name of Druid, where else would I be?" she yelled back. She saw the stain of blood on the leg of the middle one and began rummaging in the wooden chest for old linens to tear for bandages. "Bring him in here," she commanded. The wounded warrior they carried had fainted from shock and loss of blood. "We are Erk and Buan of the Finna," said the one lifting the wounded man onto the pallet and removing his weapons. "The one we carry is called Brian." Erk was a heavy-set warrior of 28 summers, clad entirely in leather. His hair was blonde, long, and tied back in one thick braid, bound with a strip of yellow deerskin. Around his neck, hanging from a leather thong, was a bronze triskel, the triple spiral that spoke of the 3 worlds always in motion. A fierce-looking dagger protruded from one boot, and a sword dangled in its sheath strapped across his back. Strapped over the sword was a bronze-covered round shield. Evna did not immediately realize that Buan was a woman of about 18 years. All she noticed were the blue tattoo spirals across her cheeks and nose, and the shaggy brown hair ending in loose braids intertwined with strips of red leather. Then she saw the faint swell of her breasts under the jerkin. Her clothing was identical to the man's, but her triskel was gold, indicating a higher birth. Instead of a sword, she had a quiver of arrows over her shoulder, and tied to it a bow of yew. The wounded man also had a bow of ashwood, and a quiver of red arrows. But what Evna noticed with greatest interest was his sword, strapped to his waist and to his good leg. It was sheathed in a casing of stamped red leather, covered with intricate spirals and other markings, which she would have liked to examine. Erk stowed the weapons in a corner. "We were hunting a boar and Brian shot him," the man stated. "It was a clean shot, but the beast wasn't dead," added Buan. "Brian went to finish him and set his spirit free when the pig gored his leg." Brian let out low, incoherent words, something about blood and ravens. "He's afraid he'll be food for the crows if we don't do something quickly," Erk muttered. "He's not food for the barrows yet," said Evna, as she inspected the gash on his thigh and tore open the leg of his hide pants. "Hold him down while I clean and dress the wound." Erk and Buan took Brian's arms and feet as Evna reached for the waters of life from the shelf. She poured some directly onto the wound and some onto a cloth, which she used to clean away the blood. She left another cloth, soaked in the waters of life, on top of the wound, while she put oak bark, comfrey, vervain, and figwort into the cauldron, which had come to a boil. Lifting the cauldron with a thick hazel rod, she carried it to the pallet. When it had cooled, she soaked another clean linen in the brew and applied it to the wound. Brian gasped, moaned, and fainted, which Evna considered a blessing. Now she could work in peace. Proceeding quickly, Evna took a thin needle and thread from a basket and soaked them briefly in the waters of life. She examined the wound carefully. It was not long, but very deep. The boar had swung upwards with its head and caught the flesh of the leg on its tusk. Only a few stitches were needed, but such wounds were deceptive, she knew. Even if the bleeding was staunched and the skin healed, the deepest parts of the injury might never repair properly. She had seen men die of such wounds. "I'll need to apply these compresses every hour or so for the next few days," she said. "What can we give you in thanks?" asked Erk. "I could use fresh meat. If you could find a hare or a pheasant for the stew pot, I'd be most grateful. Brian is going to need the broth to thicken his blood." Erk and Buan bowed slightly to acknowledge her wishes. They were grateful and in awe of this forest woman who possessed the healing powers. As trained warriors, they traveled in bands for protection, yet here was a woman who lived alone in the wilderness. She clearly had the protection of the spirits, for there were no weapons in her house, except the gold-covered bronze sickle on her belt. It was hard to tell if it was a weapon, or for the cutting of grains and simples, or if it was for magic. Maybe it was for all three? But they wouldn't dare ask. Hadn't they heard all their lives how Druid could lay mountains flat, or raise up a fog that would swallow a fleet of ships? Best to leave such matters alone. They had enough to worry about, patrolling the borders to keep out cattle thieves and the men of the north. Buan and Eric excused themselves and trotted off to find fresh game as payment for Evna. "Why do you think she lives alone?" Buan asked. Eric shrugged. "She is Nemid-born, daughter of a chieftain. She could have been a wife of the first degree, with her own lands and cattle if she wanted. It is a mystery to me." Eric frowned slightly as he slowed his pace to spy out suitable brush for cover. The Druid are always testing themselves. They must prove themselves to the gods, so they make a sacrifice of their lives. The greatest ones even volunteer to be buried alive so that their blood nourishes the land and the people have enough to eat. It is never wise to question the ways of the Druid. They are driven by forces none of us can understand. Buan nodded silently. She had spotted a hare emerging from a thicket of ferns and was easing an arrow out of the quiver and notching it onto her bow for the kill.